Have you ever felt completely consumed by someone, replaying their texts, analyzing their every word, imagining your future together, even though deep down you just met or barely know them? What if I told you that it might not be love at all, but limerence? That's not a real connection. It's an addiction to the fantasy of love. So it feels intense, euphoric, maybe even magical, but in reality, it can leave you feeling anxious, obsessed, and further away from true love. I'm Lise Leblanc, therapist, author, and life coach, and today I am talking about something that can feel overwhelming, confusing, and something that's often mistaken for love. Later in this video, I'll talk about why people with borderline and narcissistic personality disorder, or strong traits of these disorders, often experience limerence, and I will ask you 5 questions to help you figure out whether you are experiencing love or limerence. Okay, so in case you're not familiar with the term limerence, let me explain. So this isn't just a crush or an infatuation, it's a full-blown romantic or emotional obsession, often driven more by fantasy than reality. And it happens when you're more attached to the idea of a perfect partner, and then you project that fantasy onto someone who seems to fit the criteria, even if you barely know them or they're not interested in you. For the limerent person, there's a powerful craving for reciprocation. And with that comes emotional swings. So feeling euphoric when things are going well and devastated when they're not. So it's important to note that all limerence involves obsession, but not all obsession is limerence. Obsession can be about anything, whereas limerence is very specific to romantic and emotional obsessions that are driven by longing, fantasy, and a craving for connection and validation. Sometimes limerence only goes one way, meaning the object of limerence isn't interested or emotionally involved, at least not to the same level. They may not even be aware of the intensity of what's being projected onto them. This can lead to confusion, heartache, and frustration for the limerent person who feels deeply connected to someone who isn't actually participating in the same emotional experience or relationship. So the connection feels real to the limerent, but it's mostly happening in their mind and driven by their idealization and fantasizing. And as the limerent, you become completely obsessed and fixated on the other person, analyzing everything they say or do. Maybe you ask yourself, oh, what does this text mean? What was there a hidden message in that? Are they pretending not to like me? Or are they just waiting for me to make the next move? I know they said they're not interested, but why did they glance at me like that? So you're just analyzing and obsessing over every little interaction, and you start creating stories in your mind, convincing yourself that small gestures or casual conversations hold deeper or different meanings than they probably do. And the more you try to analyze, the more tangled your thoughts become, leaving you stuck in a loop of fantasy and emotional neediness. And meanwhile, any behavior that doesn't align with your fantasy, you just dismiss it, justify it, or twist it to fit the narrative. In the case where the object of limerence does reciprocate, things can get even more complicated, because now you have 2 people bonding over projected ideals and fantasy. So the relationship feels very euphoric and deeply romantic at first, but it lacks emotional stability and depth. When the reality of who each person actually is begins to surface, it inevitably creates disappointment, disillusionment, and sometimes emotional withdrawal, which can trigger intense fears of abandonment and rejection, as well as symptoms of withdrawal from the addiction. At this point, the relationship starts to look more like addiction, with intense highs and devastating lows. You might find yourself chasing the next emotional fix, craving that intense attention and connection, just the way someone might crave a drug. And like addiction, you might start compromising your values, ignoring red flags, staying in a relationship that's emotionally damaging simply because you're hooked on the highs and you can't bear the crash that comes when those highs disappear. And these moments are unbearable, filled with anxiety, emptiness, and a deep sense of loss. Facing that withdrawal period or that emotional detox is incredibly painful. But as hard as it is, moving through this discomfort and pain is the first step towards healing and emotional freedom. So whether the limerence, affection, validation, idealization is reciprocated or not, it is rooted in fantasy, not reality. And that makes the emotional experience very unstable and often very painful in the long run. Now, things can get even more complicated when a limerent person is already in a committed relationship. So limerence is often a long-standing pattern that doesn't just disappear when they settle down with someone. In fact, for some people, the urge to seek out fantasy over reality persists even when they're married. So the limerent person may find themselves craving that intense, idealized emotional connection again and again. And so as the spark of their marriage starts to fade, they may turn their attention to a new person, seeking that same intoxicating high that they experienced in the past. And this creates a cycle where real relationships are constantly being overshadowed by the allure of the fantasy and the emotional rush of a new fixation. This often leads to emotional affairs, sometimes full-blown affairs, where the limerent person disconnects from their spouse by creating a fantasy and a narrative to justify themselves. So they convince themselves that the new relationship is special, that they found their soulmate, that this is a deep connection that they're missing in their current relationship. Whatever the narrative to justify the behavior, the purpose is to avoid shame and feeling like a bad person. And it's also to avoid the collapse of the fantasy. Because if the fantasy collapses, the limerent would have to face some painful realizations and emotions. It's just like getting off a drug. You have to go through this painful detox where you feel sick, obsessed, and unable to feel normal or at ease. As promised, let me explain why people with strong borderline and narcissistic traits or full-blown disorder tend to experience limerence more than most. For someone with borderline traits, the intense need for validation, emotional intensity, and connection, as well as the fear of abandonment, can cause them to become very fixated on one person, often idealizing them and believing that this person can finally meet their unmet emotional needs and provide the love and stability that they've been longing for. Limerence in this case becomes a way of clinging to an idealized version of someone who seems to be able to offer emotional security and stabilize their emotions and sense of identity. But when reality fails to match the fantasy, it can trigger deep emotional distress and reinforce the cycle of obsession and disappointment. For someone with narcissistic traits, limerence is often centered on the idea of the other person as a mirror, someone who reflects their idealized self back to them. Now, you don't need to have a personality disorder to experience limerence. It can happen to anyone, especially during times of emotional vulnerability, unmet needs, or major life transitions. However, if you notice this pattern repeating, so falling intensely for unavailable or idealized people over and over again, struggling with obsession, then it's worth exploring this with a mental health professional. Often, these patterns are rooted in deeper attachment wounds, addiction, or other mental health problems. Okay, so how do you know if it's limerence or real love? Here are 5 questions to help you figure this out. 1, is your relationship with this person based in reality, or is it mostly playing out as a fantasy in your mind? In other words, are you actually building a life and a relationship with this person over time, or just imagining it? 2, are you able to maintain your sense of self and personal boundaries, or are you willing to compromise your needs and values to keep their attention or to impress them? 3, do you feel emotionally safe and seen by this person, or are you constantly seeking signs of their affection and fearing their rejection? 4, is the love and trust growing steadily over time, or is it urgent, unstable, and fueled by emotional highs and lows? 5, do you have a pattern of obsessing over people that you barely know, or fixating on someone who is not interested in you, or at least not as interested in you as you are in them? If you are struggling with limerence, please know that you're not alone. And if you need help breaking unhealthy relationship patterns, consider reaching out to a mental health professional in your area, or consider the coaching programs that I've linked in the description section below. If you found this video helpful, please like, comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear this today.